Picture an old map, not a modern satellite image with its clinical precision, but a hand-drawn chart from 1650, the kind where cartographers like Joan Blow or Nicholas Sanson filled unknown spaces with speculation and hope and honest humility about the limits of human knowledge. Your finger traces across the parchment, the texture of paper that has survived centuries, moving east from the familiar coastlines of Europe, where every inlet has been charted and named, crossing the territories you recognize. And then, somewhere past Moscow with its golden domes, past the Caspian Sea where sturgeon still swim in depths no European had plumbed, past the edges of what seemed knowable to the men who drew these lines with ink mixed from oak galls and iron salts, your finger enters a vast expanse labeled with a single mysterious word: Tartary. The letters stretch across distances that dwarf entire European nations, across steppes where the grass grows taller than a rider on horseback, across mountains whose peaks had never felt European boots, across deserts where the wind sculpts dunes into forms that exist for a day and then dissolve back into formlessness. And those 6 letters, Tartary, carry with them something more than mere geography. They carry mystery. They carry longing. They carry the weight of everything Europeans couldn't quite understand about the heart of the largest landmass on Earth, that vast interior where caravans moved along routes older than Rome, where peoples spoke languages no European could pass, where civilizations rose and fell in the spaces between empires. Close your eyes for a moment, truly close them, and try to imagine standing on the Central Asian steppe at dusk. Not reading about it, but being there. The light, that particular golden blue that comes only in the hour before the stars emerge, when the sun has set but its glow still clings to the western horizon like a memory refusing to fade. The grass, feather grass they called it, steeper, taller than it looks from a distance, reaching to your waist, to your chest in places, bends in waves before the endless wind. Each gust creates patterns of movement that ripple across the landscape, like water, like the surface of an ocean made of green and gold. The air, breathe it in, smells of dust and distance and wild time crushed underfoot, of grassland stretching so far that your eyes can't find its end, only a horizon that curves with the curve of the earth itself, of space, vast, overwhelming, humbling space. Behind you, somewhere in the immense interior, stand the cities of the Silk Road, Samarkand, where in 1420 Ulugh Observatory tracked stars with such precision that his measurements of the solar year differed from modern calculations by less than 1 minute. Bukhara, where the Kalian minaret has stood since 1127, its 48 meters of baked brick rising in elegant taper, every geometric pattern in the brickwork itself, calculated with mathematical precision by craftsmen whose names are lost but whose skill speaks across centuries. Kashgar at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, where Marco Polo rested in 1273 and marveled at Sunday markets that drew traders from a month's journey in every direction. But here, in this particular moment, there is only grass and sky, and the sense that you're standing at the center of something vast that you cannot quite name. A feeling, old as humanity itself, of being simultaneously at the heart of the world and at its uttermost margin, of being home and being utterly lost, of understanding that the earth is larger than any one person's knowing, and that mystery is not something to be feared or conquered, but simply accepted, honored, allowed to be. This was Tartary. Not Tartaria. Not yet. Just Tartary. A place that existed more as an idea than as a nation, more as a blank space waiting to be filled than as a civilization with clear boundaries and known histories. The mapmakers drew it in, because they had to call that vast region something, because leaving it blank seemed like an admission of defeat, and Tartary was the word that came to hand. Borrowed from the Tartars, those nomadic peoples who swept across the plains centuries before under Genghis Khan and his sons, and left their mark on medieval imagination and medieval fear. Sit with that image for a moment. Feel the weight of it. Cartographers in Amsterdam or London or Paris, men like Guillaume de Lisle, who in 1706 drew one of the most detailed maps of Tartary, or John Senec's, whose 1721 atlas showed Great Tartary stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific. These men who had never felt the wind across those steppes, never tasted the dust of those deserts, never heard the call to prayer echoing from the minarets of Samarkand, at dawn when the muezzin's voice carries across empty streets still wet with dew, drawing lines and writing names across territories they could barely imagine. What courage it must have taken to acknowledge ignorance so openly, to write Tartary across a space large enough to swallow all of Europe, and admit we don't really know what's there. We've heard stories, we've talked to travelers who talked to traders who heard from their fathers, but we don't know. What humility, what honest, beautiful humility to acknowledge through that simple designation that this was territory beyond their knowing. The maps themselves are beautiful. If you've ever seen them in museum collections or high-resolution scans that let you zoom in until you can see the texture of the paper, the places where the ink pooled slightly, the human hand behind each line, the coastlines rendered in careful detail where European ships had charted them, every harbour, every cape, every river mouth documented with the precision that comes from survival, depending on accurate knowledge. The territories of Europe drawn with increasing exactness as surveys improved, as triangulation became more sophisticated, as the known world shrank under the weight of accumulated measurement. And then, that vast interior, Grand Tartary sprawling across the steppes north of China, Chinese Tartary where the Qing dynasty held uncertain sway over territories it claimed but couldn't always control. Independent Tartary for the Khanates that answered to no distant emperor, the Kazakh hordes, the remnants of the Chagatai Khanate, smaller political entities that rose and fell with the seasons. Muscovite Tartary where Russia was gradually inexorably expanding southward and eastward under Catherine the Great and her successors, pushing into territories that had been beyond reach for centuries. Each designation covering territories larger than France, each containing multitudes, each representing not so much knowledge as the acknowledgement of not knowing, of mystery accepted rather than mystery denied. But something happened between then and now. Tartary disappeared from maps, not gradually, not with the slow fade of a name falling out of use, but decisively. The 19th century dawned, and that word began to shrink, replaced by new names like Turkestan, by new borders drawn with the precision of empires that had actually conquered the territories they claimed, by new understandings shaped by Russian expansion and British influence in what they called the Great Game. By the 20th century, when Stalin carved Central Asia into 5 Soviet republics in 1924, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, names chosen to emphasize ethnic divisions and ensure no single republic could become powerful enough to challenge Moscow. Tartary was gone entirely, remembered only in old atlases gathering dust in libraries where no one looked anymore, in footnotes to histories of cartography read only by specialists, in the fading memories of geographers who knew that maps are always both representations of reality and reflections of ignorance, that every map tells you as much about the map maker as about the territory mapped. A name, erased, not violently, not suddenly, but erased nonetheless, as surely as wind erases footprints from sand, as surely as time erases the sharpness from mountains, as surely as rivers erase the banks that once confined them. And then, decades into the 21st century, around 2015 or so, something curious happened, something unexpected. Tartary returned, not to maps. Maps don't work that way anymore, don't have room for mystery, don't acknowledge the limits of knowing, but to imagination, to desire, to the human hunger for meaning that official narratives seem increasingly unable to feed. It returned not as a geographic designation for poorly understood territories, but as something else entirely, as Tartaria, a lost civilization of impossible grandeur, a culture that supposedly built magnificent structures across continents, that possessed advanced technologies erased from history, that flourished in an age before our current timeline, and was systematically hidden from human knowledge by forces that control what we're allowed to know. The conspiracy theory emerged online, gathering momentum on Reddit forums, YouTube channels, Facebook groups, drawing together threads from Victorian architecture and old maps and alternative timelines, and a deep, abiding suspicion that official history cannot be trusted. Believers point to ornate buildings from the 1890s that seem too beautiful, too sophisticated to have been built when they were. They speak of a mud flood that supposedly buried the lower floors of old structures sometime in the 1800s. They claim that world's fairs like Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition were actually the repurposing of ancient Tartarian architecture, and they insist, with a passion that cannot be dismissed as simple foolishness, that this knowledge has been deliberately suppressed. Tonight, we're going to explore both versions of this story. The historical Tartary, that real designation on real maps that represented European confusion about Central Asia, and the modern Tartaria, that fictional civilization that has captured imaginations and sparked passionate belief in hidden history. We'll walk the line between what was real and what has been imagined, between the genuine sophistication of Central Asian empires and the projection of modern desires onto the past, between actual mysteries still unresolved by archaeology and manufactured mysteries that serve psychological needs. Because here's what makes this story worth exploring carefully, respectfully, without mockery or condescension. The historical Tartary genuinely was mysterious. Central Asia genuinely was home to sophisticated civilizations that the West barely understood and often still doesn't. Magnificent architecture genuinely does exist across that vast region, buildings so beautiful they seem to belong to dreams, to exist in that liminal space between what is and what might be. And the historical record genuinely has gaps, blank spaces where empires rose and fell without leaving the documentary evidence that European history takes for granted. The appeal of the Tartaria theory isn't based on nothing. It's based on the recognition, however distorted by subsequent elaboration, that something remarkable existed in Central Asia, that we don't know everything about the past, that institutions sometimes do lie about history, that the official narrative has been shaped by power and by prejudice, and by the simple fact that those who write history tend to be the victors. The problem isn't the questioning. Questioning is good. Questioning is essential. Questioning is how knowledge advances. The problem is where the answers lead, when imagination disconnects entirely from evidence, when the desire for mystery becomes more important than the patient work of actually solving mysteries, when comfort matters more than truth. So let's begin, where all good explorations begin, at the edge of what we know, looking out across the vast steppes and mountain ranges and desert cities of Central Asia, asking what was really there, what we've forgotten, what we've never known, and why the idea of a hidden civilization speaks so powerfully to something deep in the human need for mystery and meaning. Before we venture deeper into this landscape where history and myth intertwine like smoke and shadow, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Comment below and tell me your location, and whether you'd heard of Tartary before, whether the name meant something to you already, or whether this is your first encounter with a word that once appeared on every map of Asia and has now become the center of one of the internet's most passionate alternative history movements. Where are you, and what brought you here, to this quiet corner where we explore the spaces between knowing and not knowing? The steppes stretch endlessly beneath the vast Central Asian sky, and the wind that crosses them has been blowing for millennia, carrying dust and seeds and stories, carrying the pollen of wildflowers that bloom for a week and then surrender to the sun, carrying the memory of empires that rose and fell before Europe even knew they existed. Tonight, that wind carries us eastward, toward the heart of the continent, toward places that were once called Tartary, toward the intersection of history and imagination, where truth and myth weave together like threads in an ancient carpet, like light and shadow on the steppe at sunset, like memory and longing in the human heart. Listen, can you hear it? Not with your ears, but with something deeper. That sound beneath the wind. Like the whisper of Sogdian traders who once traveled these routes, speaking a language descended from ancient Persian, keeping accounts in an alphabet borrowed from Syriac Christians, carrying silk and spices and ideas from one end of the known world to the other, like the echo of hoofbeats from Mongol cavalry under commanders like Subutai, whose 1223 reconnaissance force rode from Mongolia to southern Russia and back, a journey of more than 8,000 kilometers accomplished in 2 years through territories where no maps existed and where survival depended on reading the land itself, like a text written in grass and stone and water. Like the quiet prayers of Persian poets like Jami, who found refuge in 15th century Herat and wrote verses that still echo in Afghan tea houses today, verses about love and loss and the soul's journey toward understanding. Like the song of craftsmen at work, the ring of hammer on metal, the scrape of trowel against brick, the satisfied sigh when a tile fits perfectly into its place in a pattern that will outlive the hands that shaped it. The wind remembers everything. It has touched the walls of Samarkand when they were new, when Timur's craftsmen brought from Damascus, after its conquest in 1401, created tile work using techniques that took 3 generations to perfect, each generation adding slightly to what came before, each master teaching apprentices who would become masters who would teach the next wave. It has blown across battlefields that decided the fate of empires, like Talis in 751 CE, where Arab and Chinese armies met in a valley far from both their homelands, and where Chinese prisoners of war taught their captors the secret of papermaking, changing the course of world history through that transfer of knowledge born from defeat. It has carried the smoke from caravansaries where merchants from China met merchants from Arabia and exchanged not just goods but ideas, technologies, dreams of what the world might be, where conversations happened in half a dozen languages with translation chains running through interpreters who themselves barely understood what they were mediating, where deals were struck and friendships formed, and sometimes, in the quiet hours after the trading was done, someone would tell a story or sing a song, and for a moment the vastness of the world would contract to the size of a circle of firelight, and everyone sitting there would understand that they were part of something larger than themselves. The first thing to understand about historical Tartary, the real Tartary that appeared on maps for 3 centuries before vanishing into political reorganization, is that it was never a single nation, never a unified empire with one ruler sitting on one throne in one capital issuing decrees that ran from border to border. It was not like France or England or China, political entities with clear boundaries and centralized authority. When European cartographers divided this vast region into several Tartaries, they were trying to impose order on something their mental frameworks couldn't quite accommodate, something more fluid than their notion of statehood allowed, something that existed in the spaces between empires, connected by trade routes and kinship networks and religious affiliations that mattered more than lines on maps. Take Grand Tartary, the term that appeared on maps like the 1730 Homonaires Atlas, covering roughly what we now call Central Asia and parts of Siberia. In the 1600s and 1700s, this designation encompassed territories that contained the remnants of the Chagatai Khanate, various Kazakh hordes who moved with the seasons, the Dzungar Khanate before its brutal destruction by Qing forces in 1758, and countless smaller political entities that rose and fell with the fortunes of individual leaders, with droughts and abundant rains, with the success or failure of raids and alliances. Or Chinese Tartary, which Europeans used to describe territories that China claimed but often couldn't effectively control, places like the Tarim Basin, where the ancient Silk Road cities of Khotan and Turpan maintained degrees of autonomy even under nominal Chinese rule, where the distance from Beijing meant that imperial authority arrived late and left early, where local rulers paid tribute when they had to and ignored demands when they could get away with it. In the 1750s, these territories witnessed brutal warfare as the Qing dynasty, under the Qinglong Emperor, launched the campaigns that would finally bring them under direct Chinese control. The Dzungar people, or Rat Mongols who had built a powerful Khanate, were systematically destroyed. Between 1755 and 1758, through warfare, disease, and deliberate massacre, their population collapsed from perhaps 600,000 to less than 100,000. It was genuine genocide, one of the most thorough erasures of a people in recorded history. And yet we know about it. We have Kaing records of the campaigns. We have archaeological evidence of destroyed Dzungar settlements. We have genetic evidence of the population collapse. We have records from neighboring peoples. We have the oral histories of Dzungar survivors whose descendants still carry that memory today. Even when a powerful empire deliberately tries to destroy a people and suppress memory of them, traces remain. Records survive. The landscape preserves evidence. Neighboring cultures remember. Descendants carry forward fragments of identity and history. Complete erasure, the kind the Tartaria theory imagines for its fictional civilization, is functionally impossible. The name itself, Tartari, came from the Tartars. But here's where language reveals something interesting about European attitudes, about how fear and prejudice shape even the words we use. The original name was Tartar, T-A-T-A-R, referring to various Turkic and Mongolic peoples, but Europeans often changed it to Tartar, adding an extra up because it made the word resemble Tartarus. Tartarus, the deepest part of the Greek underworld, the prison of the Titans, the place of eternal punishment where those who offended the gods suffered torments beyond imagination, a place of darkness and terror and hopelessness. Tartarus, Tartars. The association wasn't accidental. Matthew Paris, the 13th first century English chronicler, whose illustrated manuscripts still survive in Cambridge, literally wrote that these people came as if from Tartarus when describing the Mongol invasions. The wordplay was intentional. It reflected fear, certainly, but also a kind of theological framing, a need to fit the inexplicable horror of the Mongol conquests into a Christian cosmology that could make sense of them. The Mongols who destroyed Kiev in 1240, who defeated Polish and Hungarian armies at Legnica and Moshi in 1241, who seemed unstoppable until they withdrew back to the steppes to resolve succession disputes. These became in European imagination not just dangerous enemies but demons from the underworld, supernatural threats, forces beyond mere military opposition. And they weren't entirely wrong to be terrified. The Mongol invasions genuinely were catastrophic for much of Eurasia. When Genghis Khan's son Tolui led armies into Khwarezm in 1219 to 1221, cities like Urgench and Merv were systematically destroyed, not just defeated, destroyed, razed, erased. At Merv, which the 11th first century historian Nizam al-Mulk had called the mother of the world for its learning and commerce, for its libraries that held manuscripts from across the Islamic world, for its markets where goods from Spain met goods from China, the Mongols spent 13 days systematically massacring the population. Contemporary accounts, which may exaggerate but convey the scale of horror, claim 700,000 dead. Imagine that, not as an abstract number, as people, as individual human beings, a scholar halfway through copying a manuscript, a merchant closing up his shop at the end of the day, a mother nursing her infant, a child learning to ride, an elderly craftsman teaching his grandson, a baker pulling bread from the oven, a musician tuning his instrument. 700,000 individual lives, each one a universe of memories and hopes and relationships, each one extinguished. This was real erasure, not conspiracy but conquest, not hidden knowledge but destroyed knowledge, and it genuinely leaves gaps in our understanding of what was achieved in Khwarezm before the Mongol invasions, of what books were in those libraries, of what discoveries were being made by scholars we'll never know existed. But, and this is crucial, the Mongols weren't just destroyers. The narrative that stops there misses something essential. After conquest came something unexpected. After the terror came the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, when the largest contiguous empire in human history maintained security across the Silk Road from the 1260s to the 1360s, when merchants could travel from Beijing to the Mediterranean with less fear of bandits than they'd face on the roads around Paris. Giovanni de Pian del Carpine, a Franciscan friar, travelled from Lyon to Karakorum in 1245 to 1247 on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court. His account describes a journey of over 5,000 kilometers through territories where Mongol authority guaranteed his safe passage, where he could present his credentials at each station and receive fresh horses, food, protection, where the infrastructure of empire made the impossible routine. The postal system they created, the YAM, consisted of stations every 25–40 kilometers across the entire empire. Thousands of stations, maintained year-round, staffed by riders who knew that failing in their duty could mean death. Couriers with special tablets of authority could requisition fresh horses at each station, could demand food and shelter, could travel at speeds that wouldn't be matched until the telegraph made instant communication possible. Messages could travel from Kambalik, Beijing, to Sarai on the Volga, a distance of over 6,000 kilometers in perhaps 90 days. Think about that. Information crossing a distance equivalent to New York to Moscow in 3 months, using nothing but horses and determination and an infrastructure built to span continents. This was Tartary too, not barbaric wasteland, but the logistics of the largest empire in history. Not mystery, but achievement. Not something hidden, but something we can study and understand and marvel at, precisely because it was so thoroughly documented, not by the Mongols themselves who left relatively few written records, but by the peoples they conquered, by the travelers who passed through, by the chroniclers who tried to make sense of what had happened to their world. One name towers over Central Asian history in the late medieval period, towers like a mountain over foothills, a name that still resonates with both grandeur and terror. Timur, known to Europeans as Tamerlane, born in 1336 near Charisabz, in what's now Uzbekistan, he rose from relatively minor nobility through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an ability to inspire loyalty that bordered on the supernatural. By the time of his death in 1405, he had conquered everything from Delhi to Damascus, from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf, had defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at Ankara in 1402, capturing him and displaying him in a cage. Or so the story goes. The details are uncertain, but the symbolism perfect. Had built an empire that rivaled the Mongols at their peak. And he was extraordinarily brutal. His armies left pyramids of skulls outside cities that resisted. At Isfahan in 1387, after a revolt that killed Timurid tax collectors, his forces massacred the population and constructed towers from the heads of the dead. At Delhi in 1398, the sack resulted in perhaps 100,000 deaths. The destruction wasn't incidental to his conquest. It was part of the strategy, calculated to inspire terror that would make future resistance unthinkable. But, and this is the paradox that makes Central Asian history so endlessly complex, so resistant to simple narratives, Timur was also a patron of arts and learning on a scale that few rulers in human history have matched. Imagine Samarkand in 1399. Timur has just returned from his conquest of northern India, from the sack of Delhi where his army slaughtered tens of thousands, and he's bringing with him 90 elephants loaded with stones quarried from Indian mountains, chosen for their color and grain, transported across deserts and mountains at enormous cost. These stones, along with artisans captured in Damascus, Isfahan, Shiraz and other conquered cities, will transform his capital into something unprecedented. In the Registan, that great central square that serves as the heart of the city, construction begins on structures that still stand today. The Bibi Kanim Mosque, built between 1399 and 1404, features a portal 38 meters high and a dome 41 meters tall. Stand in front of it, if you ever have the chance, and you'll understand why people speak of it with awe, even in ruin. The scale is overwhelming, the ambition breathtaking, the execution, even damaged by earthquakes and time, still capable of stopping your breath. The mathematical precision of its geometry, the way the tiles are arranged in patterns based on Islamic geometric principles developed by mathematicians like al-Buzjani, represents the culmination of centuries of architectural knowledge. But more than that, it represents something about the human desire to create beauty even, especially, in the midst of horror, to build something that might last when so much has been destroyed. In 2001, more than 6 centuries after the mosque was built, archaeologists found graffiti inside. Names carved by the craftsman who built it. Master Ali the architect in one place. Completed by Muhammad the tiler in another. Hidden in corners where only other builders would look. Think about that. The anonymity of most medieval craftsmen. We know the patrons' names but not the builders. And here are men leaving their signatures where only people who understand their work would find them. A message across time from people who knew their names would be forgotten but wanted to be remembered anyway, by someone, anyone. By you, perhaps, reading these words tonight, carrying for a moment the knowledge that Master Ali lived and worked and took pride in what he created. Timur's grandson Ulu Beg, born Muhammad Tiragay in 1394, while his grandfather was campaigning in Persia, ruling Samarkand from 1409 to 1449, after Timur's empire fragmented, took the patronage of learning even further, not just supporting scholars but becoming one himself. The observatory he built in the 1420s, you can still visit the ruins, featured a sextant with a radius of 40 meters, the largest astronomical instrument in the Islamic world, built into the ground itself, a curved track that allowed precise measurement of stellar positions through careful observation and geometric calculation. With it, he and his team of astronomers, men like Ali Kushji and Ghiath al-Din Jamshid, who were among the finest mathematical minds of their age, calculated the length of the sidereal year as 365 days, 6 hours, 10 minutes, and 8 seconds. The modern measurement. 365 days, 6 hours, 9 minutes, and 9.5 seconds. They were off by less than 1 minute. In 1437, using instruments made of baked brick and copper, using observations recorded with the naked eye, using mathematics developed without calculus, without computers, without any of the tools we take for granted. When you stand in the ruins of that observatory today, and the site is open to visitors, the Uzbek government maintains it as a museum, you're standing where genuine scientific achievement occurred, where human beings pushed the boundaries of what was known through patience and skill and dedication to understanding, not mysterious lost technology, not hidden knowledge, but patient observation, careful calculation, rigorous methodology. The kind of achievement that actually occurred, that we can study and understand and marvel at precisely because it was human scale, because we can follow the logic, because we can see how each discovery built on what came before. If you're finding this exploration of history and mystery compelling, this journey between what we know and what we're still discovering, this meditation on the difference between real wonder and manufactured conspiracy, take a moment to like this video. It helps others who are curious about these same questions find their way to this quiet corner where we can explore them together, where we can sit with complexity, where we don't need simple answers because the complex truth is so much richer. Samarkand. Even the name sounds like music, like water flowing over smooth stones, like wind through leaves, like something from a dream that feels more real than waking. For more than 2,000 years, this city has stood at the crossroads of Asia, not continuously prosperous, not always at peace, but persistently important, persistently itself. A place where cultures met and mingled and created something that belonged only to that specific convergence of location and time and human ambition. When Alexander the Great besieged it in 329 BCE, when it was called Marakanda, it was already an important settlement. The Sogdian traders who would dominate Silk Road commerce for centuries were establishing their networks. The patterns of trade that would connect China to the Mediterranean were beginning to form, And Samarkand sat at one of the crucial nodes where routes converged, where caravans rested, where goods and ideas changed hands. Walk through Samarkand. Today, walk through the Registan with its three great madrasas: Olive Begs built 1417 to 1420, Sherdor built 1619 to 1636, Tilia Kori built 1646 to 1660, and you're not seeing mysterious Tartarian architecture. You're seeing something much more interesting. You're seeing the evolution of building traditions across 250 years. You're seeing how techniques refined, how decoration became more elaborate, how mathematical understanding deepened, how color palettes shifted with changing trade routes and available materials. The Ulu Beg Madrasa, the earliest, shows restrained elegance, geometric patterns in blue and white, proportions based on mathematical relationships between circles and squares, beauty achieved through precision and order. The Sherdor, 2 centuries later, displays greater confidence. Lions and suns decorating the portal in apparent violation of Islamic prohibitions against depicting living creatures. But this reflects Central Asian Islam's synthesis with older Persian artistic traditions, a flexibility born from being a crossroads culture where absolute rules bent under the weight of multiple influences. The Tilia Kori, latest of the three, demonstrates technical mastery. Its interior dome covered in gold leaf, kundan in Persian, a technique of applying thin gold over elaborate painted and molded plasterwork, creating the illusion of massive weight, made weightless through beauty, of stone transformed into light. These aren't mysterious. They're the product of traditions we can trace, of techniques documented in treatises, of workshops where masters trained apprentices, who became masters who trained the next generation, of knowledge accumulating incrementally over centuries. The tiles themselves, those brilliant blues and greens and golds that seem to glow even in shadow, aren't evidence of lost technology. They're evidence of chemistry, of understanding that cobalt oxide produces that particular shade of blue when fired at 900–1000 degrees Celsius. That copper oxide creates green or turquoise depending on firing atmosphere and other minerals present. That manganese oxide yields purple or black. That all of this can be controlled through experience and careful attention to variables. A 15th century treatise from Tabriz describes the process. Grind quartz to fine powder, mix with copper oxide and soda ash, add lead oxide as a flux to lower the melting temperature, fire in a reducing atmosphere, less oxygen, more carbon monoxide, to get that luminous turquoise that defines Central Asian architecture. Trial and error across centuries produced knowledge that was then preserved and transmitted. This is how human knowledge actually develops, not through sudden mysterious leaps, not through gifts from vanished civilizations, but through incremental progress, through each generation learning from the last and adding small improvements, through mistakes that teach what doesn't work, through successes that reveal what does, through patient accumulation of understanding that looks like magic only if you don't see the centuries of work behind it. Consider a specific example. The Ghuriya Mir, Timur's mausoleum, completed in 1404. Its dome, a double-shell structure where an outer dome visible from outside rises 12.5 meters above an inner dome that defines the interior space, distributes weight through a system of ribs, and squinches and pendentives that was pioneered by Seljuk architects in the 11th century and refined by Persian and Central Asian builders over the next 300 years. The architect who designed it, Muhammad ibn Mahmud al-Isfahani, had trained in Shiraz under masters who could trace their professional lineage back to the architects of Isfahan's Friday Mosque. The techniques weren't mysterious. They were professional knowledge, transmitted through apprenticeship, recorded in treatises, refined through practice, available to anyone willing to invest the years necessary to learn them. When the building was restored in the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet and Uzbek architects studied its structure with modern tools. They found evidence of mathematical planning, proportions based on relationships between circles and squares, dimensions chosen for both structural stability and aesthetic harmony, the golden ratio appearing in key relationships, not because the builders had mystical knowledge, but because they had eyes that could see beauty and experience that taught them how to create it. Nothing that required impossible knowledge, everything comprehensible to anyone who understands geometry and architecture and the properties of materials, everything traceable to earlier buildings and documented innovations, everything human scale and explicable. The same is true of Bukhara, the Kalian minaret, nearly 50 meters of elegance rising from a base wide enough to withstand earthquakes, has stood since 1127, has survived the Mongol destruction that leveled most of the city in 1220, has watched empires come and go, has served as lighthouse for caravans approaching across the desert, a vertical marker visible for kilometers across the flat landscape. The story, possibly apocryphal, but revealing nonetheless, claims Genghis Khan was so impressed by its beauty that he ordered it spared. Whether true or not, whether it was beauty or utility or simple chance that saved it, the minaret remains, built by Arslan Khan of the Karakhanid dynasty, using techniques that had been developing in Central Asia since the 9th century. Its foundation goes down 8 meters below ground level. Not arbitrary depth, but careful calculation. Recognition that towers need deep foundations in regions where the earth trembles. That bedrock or at least compact soil must be reached. That the weight of 48 meters of brick requires support that goes down as far as it goes up. The walls are 10 meters thick at the base, tapering to 6 meters at the top. Again, not arbitrary, but structural logic. Wide base to resist overturning, gradual taper to reduce weight as height increases, proportions that create stability while maintaining elegance. The bricks are bonded with mortar containing egg whites and camel milk, which sounds strange until you understand that proteins create strong bonds. That egg album has been used in construction for millennia because it works. That traditional knowledge often has sound chemical and physical basis even when the underlying theory isn't understood in modern terms. We know these details because Central Asian architectural traditions were documented, because treatises survived describing techniques, because later builders preserved earlier methods, because the knowledge never disappeared. It was there all along in the buildings themselves for anyone willing to study them carefully and learn from them. But let's pause here. Let's acknowledge something important before we continue, something that must be said clearly and without evasion. Much about Central Asian history genuinely is understudied, genuinely mysterious, genuinely unknown, not because of conspiracy, but because of the normal processes by which knowledge gets lost or never recorded in the first place. The Sogdians, those Iranian peoples who dominated Silk Road trade from the 4th to 8th centuries CE, established trading communities from Samarkand to Chang'an, spoke a language descended from ancient Persian, used a script derived from Syriac, served as cultural intermediaries, translating Buddhist texts from Sanskrit to Chinese, carrying ideas and innovations between civilizations that barely knew each other existed. And they're almost forgotten, not because of conspiracy, but because they operated between the major empires that dominate history books, because many of their cities were destroyed or abandoned as trade routes shifted, because their language, Sogdian, died out, replaced by Persian and Turkic languages as political circumstances changed, because nomadic peoples who passed through left fewer traces than settled civilizations, because history is always written by someone and the Sogdians weren't writing their own history, they were too busy living it, and the peoples who came after had their own stories to tell. Or consider the Khwarezmian Empire, that powerful state that controlled much of Central Asia in the 12th and early 13th centuries before Genghis Khan destroyed it. Its capital, Urgench, was a center of learning. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, the 9th century mathematician, whose name gives us the word algorithm and whose treatise Kitab al-Jabr wal Muqabala gave us algebra, came from this region. The Khwarezmians made advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, had libraries, had scholars in correspondence with counterparts across the Islamic world, had accumulated knowledge over centuries. And then the Mongols came, and in 1221, Urgench was systematically destroyed. The irrigation systems that sustained agriculture were wrecked, the libraries were burned, the scholars were killed or dispersed, much of the knowledge preserved there was lost. This was real erasure, real destruction, real gaps in our understanding that cannot be filled, because the sources are gone, not because of conspiracy or cover-up, but because conquest is destructive, because war destroys more than just buildings and lives. It destroys memory, accumulated knowledge, the slow, patient work of generations. And it genuinely leaves us with questions we cannot answer, with mysteries that are real mysteries, not manufactured ones, because the evidence that would solve them burned, or was deliberately destroyed, or simply never survived. Or think about the Scythians, those nomadic peoples who dominated the Eurasian steppes from the 9th century BCE to the 4th century CE, left extraordinary artwork, gold objects depicting animals with remarkable dynamism and detail, found in burial mounds, kurgans, across southern Russia and Central Asia. The gold pectoral found in the Tovsta Mohyla kurgan in Ukraine in 1971 weighs over a kilogram and depicts scenes of Scythian daily life with meticulous detail. But they left few written records. What we know about them comes from Greek historians like Herodotus, who visited Scythian territories and wrote about what he saw but filtered it through Greek assumptions and prejudices, from archaeology, from the burials that continue to yield surprises. In 1993, Russian archaeologist Natalia Polosmak discovered the Ice Maiden in the Yukok Plateau, a Scythian woman buried around 400 BCE with 6 horses, her body preserved by permafrost, her skin still showing elaborate tattoos of fantastical animals. The preservation is so good we can see she had breast cancer, can see what she ate from isotope analysis of her bones, can sequence her DNA and understand her relationship to modern populations. These discoveries continue. In 2001, German and Mongolian archaeologists found a Scythian royal burial at Arzan in Tuva, with over 5,000 gold objects. The forensic analysis revealed the king died around age 40-50, probably from an arrow wound that became infected. His wife, or possibly a concubine, the relationship isn't certain, was killed to be buried with him, along with 14 horses and numerous servants. The horror of that casual mass murder, preserved in the archaeological record. The strontium isotopes in the servants' teeth showing they came from different regions, brought to the capital, killed, buried. This is real mystery, real gaps in our knowledge being slowly filled by patient archaeological work, by forensic analysis, by isotope studies and DNA sequencing and careful excavation, and the piecing together of fragments into partial pictures that will never be complete, but that add incrementally to our understanding. Not conspiracy, but the challenge of understanding cultures that left limited written records. Not cover-up, but the simple fact that much of the past is lost, and what remains must be studied carefully, methodically, without rushing to conclusions, without letting imagination run ahead of evidence. Or the Tartarians, those mysterious Indo-European people who lived in the Tarim Basin. We know them primarily from mummies preserved in the desert's extreme dryness. Bodies with European features, light brown or blonde hair, long noses, tall stature, buried 2,000 years ago in what's now Western China, wrapped in woolen textiles woven in complex patterns that show technical sophistication, sometimes buried with cheese, actual cheese that has survived millennia in the dry air. They spoke languages, Tartarian A and Tartarian B, that belonged to the Indo-European family, that took an independent path of development, more closely related to Celtic and Italic languages than to the Iranian and Indic languages of surrounding regions, which raises fascinating questions about migration patterns, about how Indo-European speakers ended up in Western China, about what routes they traveled, about what happened to their original homeland. The Tarim mummies were discovered in the 1990s, studied by Chinese and international teams with increasingly sophisticated techniques. The beauty of Xiaohe, found in 2003, died around 1800 BCE. She was buried in a boat-shaped coffin, symbolism we can recognize but not fully interpret, wearing a white deerskin garment and felt boots, with a feathered hat. Her eyelashes are still visible. She looks like she died yesterday, like she might wake up and speak in a language no one alive can understand. DNA analysis reveals these people were a mixture of ancient North Eurasians and East Asians, with connections to populations from Siberia and the Pontic-Caspian steppe. They maintained trade networks, practiced Buddhism. We have Buddhist texts in Tartarian, produced sophisticated textiles using techniques that required specialized knowledge and years of training. And they vanished from history, absorbed into other populations, their language dying out, their identity dissolving into the larger groups around them, leaving behind texts scholars are still working to fully understand, mummies that preserve their faces but not their voices. Mysteries that are being solved slowly but will never be completely solved because too much is gone. These are genuine mysteries. Real civilizations that were sophisticated and influential in their time and are still being understood by modern scholarship. They deserve attention. They deserve wonder. They deserve to be learned about and appreciated and studied with the rigor they merit. But the Tartaria theory skips over all of them, ignores the actual complexity of Central Asian history, dismisses the real achievements of real peoples, and replaces it all with a simple, fictitious narrative of one great civilization that was hidden, that possessed advanced technology, that built everything worth building, that was then erased by forces that wanted to keep the truth from us. It takes the genuine sophistication of multiple distinct civilizations, the Mongols, the Timurids, the Sogdians, the Scythians, the Tocharians, the Khwarezmians, and dozens more, and erases their distinctiveness in favor of a monolithic fantasy. It takes the real architectural achievements built through centuries of accumulated knowledge and attributes them to mysterious Tartarians rather than to the actual named architects and documented traditions that created them. This is what makes the theory ultimately disrespectful. Not just wrong, but disrespectful to the memory of Master Ali the architect, whose name survives in graffiti, to Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Isfahani, who designed the Gur Amir, to Ulu Beg, who spent years observing stars, to all the craftsmen who spent lifetimes perfecting techniques for creating those luminous tiles, to all the peoples whose actual histories are rich and complex and worthy of study. The theory takes their achievements and gives them to fictional Tartarians, takes their agency and denies it, takes their humanity and erases it in favor of a convenient myth. Consider subscribing to Simply About Earth, where curiosity finds its quiet corner and wonder takes its time, where we explore the genuine mysteries of our planet without needing to invent fictional ones, where the real story of human achievement across centuries and continents is treated as the remarkable thing it actually is, where we honor the peoples who came before by studying their actual accomplishments rather than attributing them to imaginary civilizations, where we sit with complexity because truth, real truth, is always more interesting than comfortable fiction. The Mud Flood Theory. At the heart of the Tartaria conspiracy, claims that sometime in the 19th century, a catastrophic event buried the lower floors of buildings around the world. Evidence supposedly appears in old photographs showing buildings with their ground floors below street level, with basement windows at odd heights, with architecture suggesting the buildings were originally taller. And if you question why there's no historical record of such a catastrophic event, no contemporary accounts of a worldwide disaster, no geological evidence of mud deposits, no disruption visible in tree ring or ice core records, the answer is always the same. The records were suppressed. The evidence was hidden. The authorities don't want us to know. But sit with that claim for a moment. Really sit with it. What would it require for such a suppression to work? not just hiding a few documents, not just pressuring a few historians, but coordinating silence across every nation on earth, every newspaper, every diary, every letter, every photograph, every scientific institution, every geological survey, every engineering firm, every city records office, and maintaining that silence perfectly for more than a century with not a single credible whistleblower, not a single authentic document emerging, not a single piece of physical evidence that withstands scrutiny, not a single scientific analysis supporting the claim. The conspiracy required would be more impressive than the alleged catastrophe, more impossible, more fantastic. The reality, the actual documentary, physical, easily verified reality, is simpler and completely explicable. Cities throughout history have raised their street levels. They've done this for specific, documented reasons. To get above seasonal flooding, Chicago sits on land that was originally marsh, low and flat and prone to flooding whenever it rained heavily. Raising the streets, not all at once but gradually over the 1850s and 1860s, solved this problem. The project is extraordinarily well documented. We have city ordinances mandating minimum heights for new construction. We have engineering drawings showing the planned grades. We have contemporary newspaper accounts. We have photographs of the process. George Pullman, yes, the man whose name appears on railroad cars, made his early fortune as one of the engineers who specialized in raising buildings using jack screws. The technique was remarkable. Hundreds of workers would place jack screws under a building's foundation. Then, working in coordination, they would all turn their jacks one rotation. The building would rise a fraction of an inch. They'd reset, do it again. Slowly, over days or weeks, lifting entire brick structures while keeping them operational, keeping stores open, keeping people living in apartments above. The Tremont House Hotel was raised 5 feet in 1858, while guests continued staying there. Can you imagine living in a building as it's lifted off the ground? The Victorian-era equivalent of a magic trick, but documented, photographed, recorded in guests' diaries and letters, not hidden, not secret. A marvel that people wrote about and bragged about and used to demonstrate American engineering prowess. When you see a building in Chicago with its first floor below current street level, you're not seeing evidence of a mud flood. You're seeing a building that was constructed before the street raising was completed. That remained at the old grade while the street and newer buildings rose around it. This is normal. This is expected. This is in the city archives. Or Seattle. After the 1889 fire destroyed downtown, the city rebuilt 1 story higher to address flooding from tides. Puget Sound's tides are significant. The old downtown flooded regularly. The solution: raise everything. Build new streets on top of the old. The old ground floor storefronts became basements. The old sidewalks became subterranean passages. This created the Seattle Underground, which isn't hidden or mysterious. Tours run daily. You can walk the old streets, now below ground, can see the old shop windows, the old sidewalks, the purple glass skylights that once were at street level and let light into basement storage areas. The transformation isn't mysterious. It's a tourist attraction. It's in guidebooks. It's been photographed and filmed and written about extensively. New York raised portions of its streets in the 19th century to install sewers and improve drainage. London did the same. European cities routinely built new streets on top of old ones. Archaeological excavations in Rome or Athens or Istanbul reveal layer upon layer of previous street levels going back millennia. This is how cities work, how they've always worked. Build on top of what came before. Raise the grade to improve conditions. Leave older buildings at lower levels until they're eventually demolished or renovated. This is normal urban development, documented in every case, happening for practical reasons that made sense at the time, recorded in city records and engineering reports and photographs and contemporary accounts. The mud flood theory takes this normal, explainable, thoroughly documented feature of urban development and transforms it into evidence of conspiracy, assumes that such street razing couldn't be the explanation, or that even if it was, it must have been hiding something deeper, reads mystery into the mundane because mystery is what it wants to find. The world's fair buildings. The other pillar of the Tartaria theory, the claim that these elaborate exposition structures were actually ancient architecture, that the fairs were covers for revealing hidden buildings that had always been there. Let's look at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the White City. Buildings of such beauty that contemporary visitors called them dreamlike, structures that seemed too perfect, too grand, too sophisticated to be temporary. And they were grand. The administration building designed by Richard Morris Hunt, its central dome rising 80 meters, covered in white stuff that gleamed in sunlight. The machinery hall designed by Peabody and Stearns, covering more ground than any building then in existence, filled with exhibits of industrial power. The agricultural building by McKim, Mead and White, the manufactures building, the electricity building, all designed in Beaux-Arts style to look classical, timeless, permanent. But they were built in less than 3 years, using modern 1890s construction techniques, using a material called staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement and hemp fiber that could be cast into elaborate forms quickly, using wooden frames, using modern engineering, using hundreds of workers whose names appear in employment records. We have Daniel Burnham's personal papers, the chief architect who coordinated the entire project, his correspondence, his sketches, his complaints about contractors falling behind schedule, his pride in what they accomplished, his exhaustion, his grief when his partner John Root died during the planning, and he had to continue without him. We have the architectural firm's records, drawings showing every detail, specifications for materials, calculations for structural loads, correspondence about changes and problems and solutions. We have photographs taken during construction by Charles Dudley Arnold, the fair's official photographer, hundreds of photographs, showing the buildings being erected from the ground up, showing the wooden frames being covered with staff, showing the process step by step. These aren't hidden, they're in archives. They've been digitized. You can look at them online. We have articles from engineering journals describing the construction methods, how the staff was mixed, how it was applied, how quickly it could be molded, how it weathered, how it wasn't meant to last but looked magnificent for the duration of the fair. We have visitors' accounts, diaries, letters. Hundreds of thousands of people visited the fair. They wrote about it. They described what they saw. The construction process wasn't hidden. It was part of the spectacle, part of the demonstration of American industrial and artistic prowess. And after the fair closed, most of the buildings were demolished. We have records of the demolition contracts. We have photographs of the buildings being torn down. The staff, never meant to be permanent, deteriorated quickly once maintenance stopped. We have newspaper accounts of fires that destroyed several structures in January 1894, fires that spread easily because the buildings were essentially elaborate stage sets, wood and plaster, magnificent but fragile. A few buildings were preserved. The Palace of Fine Arts was reconstructed in permanent materials and still stands as Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. You can visit it, can compare it to photographs from 1893, can see how it was rebuilt to last rather than to impress briefly. All of this is documented, extensively, exhaustively. To believe these were ancient buildings requires rejecting this documentary record, requires assuming that thousands of people involved in construction and demolition all somehow kept the conspiracy, that all the records were fabricated, that the photographs were faked, that the journalists and visitors and workers all lied or were deceived. The conspiracy required is absurd, more impossible than the buildings themselves. And yet, I understand the appeal, because when you look at photographs of the White City, when you see those buildings gleaming under sun, reflected in lagoons, adorned with sculptures, They do seem otherworldly. They do seem too beautiful for mere temporary construction. They do seem to belong to a more elegant age, which they did. Not an ancient age, but the Gilded Age, when wealthy patrons valued beauty, when skilled craftsmen were plentiful and relatively inexpensive, when architectural education emphasized classical forms, when cities competed to build impressive civic structures, when temporary could still mean beautiful because beauty was valued for its own sake. The buildings weren't mysterious. They were expensive. They were the product of specific economic and social conditions that allowed for such extravagant temporary construction. They demonstrated wealth and technical prowess and cultural sophistication. They served their purpose, which was to awe and inspire and advertise American achievement. And then they were demolished because they were never meant to last, because the materials couldn't withstand weather, because maintaining them would have cost more than building permanent structures, because the fair was over and the city needed the land for other purposes. This isn't hidden, isn't mysterious. It's in the historical record, available to anyone willing to look. So why does the Tartaria theory resonate? Why do thousands find it compelling despite overwhelming evidence against it? Why does it spread despite being so thoroughly debunked? Because it speaks to something real, not about hidden civilizations, but about distrust, about the sense that we've lost something important, about the feeling that official narratives can't be trusted, about the hunger for meaning and mystery that modern life seems increasingly unable to feed. Part is aesthetic. The magnificent buildings of the 19th century genuinely are beautiful, more beautiful than much of what we build today. When people look at Victorian architecture, at those ornate brownstones and elaborate city halls and grand hotels, and feel that something has been lost, they're not wrong about the feeling. Something has been lost. Not ancient knowledge, not mysterious technology, but the prioritization of beauty and craft that created such architecture, the social and economic conditions that made elaborate ornamentation feasible, the availability of skilled craftsmen whose training began in childhood and continued for decades, the willingness to invest time and resources in beauty for its own sake. Modern construction often emphasizes efficiency and cost reduction. We build quickly. We use standardized techniques. We value function over form. The economic pressures that drive development don't reward the kind of patient, expensive craftsmanship that created Victorian ornament. This creates a genuine sense of loss, a feeling that we've traded beauty for practicality, that we've lost the ability or willingness to create buildings that inspire awe, that speaks to something beyond mere utility. The Tartaria theory takes this real feeling, this genuine aesthetic loss, and transforms it into a cosmic conspiracy. Instead of grappling with questions about changing values and economic systems and the conditions that make beauty possible or impossible, it imagines a vanished civilization that supposedly built everything beautiful. That possessed knowledge we've lost. That represents an age of greatness from which we've fallen. This is emotionally satisfying. It's simpler than the complex reality. It provides villains, the conspirators hiding truth. It provides a clear narrative of loss and potential recovery. It makes the aesthetic longing meaningful rather than merely sad. But it directs attention away from real questions, away from asking how we might create conditions that allow for beauty again, away from supporting craftspeople and artists, away from questioning the economic systems that make ornament impossible, toward a fictional past that never existed. Part is distrust. And here we must be honest and clear. Official narratives sometimes do lie. Governments suppress information. Corporate interests shape what gets taught. Colonial powers erased indigenous histories. The skepticism that feeds conspiracy theories isn't baseless. It emerges from real experiences of being misled. Consider what we've learned about how historical narrative was shaped by colonial perspectives, how indigenous American civilizations were systematically minimized in historical accounts, how the sophistication of pre-Columbian societies was underestimated for generations, how African achievements were dismissed or attributed to outside influence, how even recent history gets sanitized, how uncomfortable truths about wars and government programs and corporate misdeeds get buried or denied. When people point to these real examples of suppressed or distorted history, they're not wrong. These things happened. These things still happen. The skepticism is justified. The distrust is earned. The sense that we're not being told the whole truth comes from the accurate observation that we often aren't being told the whole truth. Where the Tartaria theory goes wrong isn't in the impulse to question. Questioning is good. Questioning is essential. Questioning is how we move from false certainty toward truer understanding. The problem is in the specific claims and the rejection of contradicting evidence. There's a vast difference between some historical narratives have been distorted by power structures and a worldwide civilization was completely hidden through an impossible conspiracy. The former is demonstrably true, well documented, important to acknowledge and address. The latter contradicts overwhelming evidence and requires conspiracy so vast and perfect that it becomes functionally impossible. The psychological appeal, the feeling that something important has been hidden, resonates because sometimes things have been hidden. The theory taps into that valid distrust and redirects it toward elaborate fantasy that provides emotional satisfaction without the hard work of actually investigating which specific claims deserve skepticism and which are well supported. There's also something deeply human about wanting to believe in lost civilizations, in ages of greater knowledge that came before, in hidden wisdom that might be recovered. These narratives appear across cultures throughout history. Atlantis, Lemuria, Mo, Shambhala, the Garden of Eden, golden ages that existed before the fall, before we lost the way, before knowledge was corrupted or hidden or forgotten. The Tartaria theory is simply the latest iteration of this ancient human impulse. This need to believe that somewhere in the past, things were better, knowledge was greater, beauty was more accessible, life was more meaningful. And that impulse isn't entirely misguided. We have lost knowledge. Languages die and take unique ways of understanding with them. Indigenous traditions vanish under colonial pressure. Ancient texts burn, traditional crafts disappear. When master craftspeople die without teaching apprentices, the world genuinely loses knowledge continuously. But the losses are quieter and more diffuse than the theory imagines. Not a single catastrophic erasure, but the accumulated effect of countless small losses. A grandmother's recipe forgotten because no one wrote it down. A traditional building technique abandoned because cheaper methods exist. An oral history that dies with its last keeper because younger generations are busy with other concerns. These losses add up over generations into vast amounts of vanished knowledge, but they leave traces. They follow patterns. They don't require impossible conspiracies. They're the natural result of how human cultures change, how knowledge transmission works or fails, how economic and social pressures shape what gets preserved and what gets forgotten. The Tartaria theory takes this real, painful, ongoing process of cultural loss and transforms it into a grand narrative of deliberate suppression. It makes the loss meaningful rather than tragic. It provides enemies to blame. It creates hope that knowledge might be recovered through revelation rather than being simply gone. But in doing so, it directs attention away from actual histories we might recover, away from real peoples whose stories deserve telling, away from genuine mysteries that patient work might solve, away from legitimate questions about how power shapes historical narrative, toward a fictional civilization that never existed, toward claims that contradict evidence, toward a worldview that requires rejecting expertise and methodology and the patient accumulation of knowledge in favor of intuition and feeling and the desire for simple answers to complex questions. When we talk about Tartary, the real historical Tartary, we should be talking about people like Baba, born in 1483 in Andijan in the Fergana Valley, in what's now Uzbekistan, a direct descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan through different lineages, a man who wrote one of the great autobiographies of world literature, the Baburnama. His memoir describes life in late medieval Central Asia with extraordinary detail, describes gardens he designed in Kabul with fountains and fruit trees, describes the varieties of melons available in different markets, which ones were sweetest, how they should be eaten, which came into season when, describes poetry gatherings where friends recited verses in Persian and Chagatai Turkic, and debated the merits of different styles and schools, describes military campaigns, architecture, his struggle with alcoholism, his grief at the death of his mother, his complicated relationship with his sons, his missing his homeland after conquering India and founding what would become the Mughal Empire, his poems of longing for the melons of Samarkand, the cold streams of the Fergana Valley, the particular light of autumn afternoons in the mountains. This is a human voice from the regions Europeans called Tartary, not mysterious, not hidden, just a person whose autobiography sits in museums and libraries, translated into dozens of languages, available to anyone who wants to read it, who wants to hear a 16th century Central Asian ruler's voice, speaking across centuries about gardens and war and poetry and longing and the taste of melons, or Ibn Battuta's 14th century travels through Central Asia, the Moroccan explorer who visited Samarkand and Bukhara and Khwarezm in the 1330s, a decade before Timur's birth, when those cities were still recovering from Mongol destruction but already rebuilding, already reasserting their importance. His descriptions of the cities provide contemporary accounts of daily life. He describes staying in a madrasa in Bukhara, sleeping in a small cell, eating with students and scholars, attending lectures on Islamic law and theology. He describes eating pilaf made with mutton and rice and carrots, describes watching craftsmen in the bazaars, metalworkers hammering copper into bowls, tile makers painting geometric patterns, weavers at their looms creating silk textiles that would travel to China or Europe. He describes the hospitality extended to travelers, the tradition that anyone arriving at a city gate would be taken in, fed, given a place to sleep, the recognition that travel was dangerous, and travelers deserved protection, the understanding that someone who had journeyed from Morocco to Central Asia carried news and stories worth hearing. These accounts exist. They're in libraries. They've been translated and annotated and studied. Scholars can compare Ibn Battuta's descriptions with archaeological findings and see how accurate he was, can verify his routes, can confirm the existence of buildings he mentions, can trace the trade goods he describes. Nothing is hidden. The knowledge is there for anyone willing to look. Or Xu Xianzhong's 17th century account of traveling the Silk Road as part of a Qing diplomatic mission. Chinese perspective on the same regions describes the yurt dwellings of Kazakh nomads, their hospitality, the ritual of offering kumis, fermented mare's milk, to guests, their horse culture, children learning to ride before they could walk steadily, entire families' wealth measured in horses, describes the trading practices in cities like Tashkent, the varieties of fruit available in markets, dried apricots, fresh pomegranates, Persian melons that had to be transported carefully lest they bruise, the way different peoples interacted, Chinese and Persian and Turkic and Russian merchants, all negotiating in multiple languages with translators facilitating deals that would send goods across continents. These accounts exist. They're being translated. Scholars study them. They provide windows into daily life, into how people actually lived in the regions Europeans called Tartary, not mysteriously, not with advanced technology, but with the complexity and richness that all human societies develop, with specific foods and specific customs and specific relationships, with names and faces and individual stories, with all the mundane detail that makes history human scale and comprehensible rather than mythological. Let the theories dissolve into the night. Let them be carried away by the wind that crosses the steppes, that same wind that has been blowing for millions of years, that will continue blowing long after we're gone, that doesn't care what we believe about the lands it touches. Let the conspiracies fall away, not because you're being told to abandon them, but because they're unnecessary weight. Because truth, real truth, complex truth, difficult truth, is more interesting than comfortable fiction. Because the actual story of Central Asian history is richer and stranger and more worthy of wonder than any conspiracy theory could ever be. Let the certainties soften into questions, because questions are the beginning of understanding. Because admitting I don't know is not weakness but strength. Because the willingness to say I was wrong is what separates genuine inquiry from ideology. Because the spaces where we're uncertain, where the evidence is incomplete, where mysteries remain, those are the spaces where real discovery happens. Rest now. Rest in the knowledge that the world is vast and complex and full of real mysteries that don't require impossible conspiracies to be fascinating. That human achievement across centuries created genuine beauty through skill and patience and the accumulation of knowledge. That though we don't know everything about the past, though gaps remain and mysteries persist and whole civilizations left fewer traces than we'd like, we can know enough. The night settles across Central Asia, as it has settled for millions of years. The same darkness that wrapped around Silk Road caravans when they stopped for the night in the vastness between cities. The same darkness that covered the tents of Mongol armies on the eve of battle. The same darkness that fell on Samarkand when Timur's craftsmen finished their day's work and returned to homes and families. Stars emerge. First Venus low in the west, that evening star that has guided travelers since humans first began journeying. Then Arcturus, bright and orange, that spring star that signals the season for planting. Then the whole tapestry of the Milky Way spreading across the sky like a river of light, like a road leading somewhere we cannot follow but can imagine, can dream about, can use to navigate both outer journeys and inner ones. These are the same stars, the same constellations that guided traders across these wastes for thousands of years before telescopes existed, that Ulugh observed from his Samarkand observatory, calculating their positions with precision that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries, that nomadic peoples navigated by through generations before cities even existed, when all of Central Asia was grassland and wandering herds and the patient movement of peoples following seasons and water, and the eternal cycle of birth and growth and death and renewal. Constellations that don't change. That wheel overhead in patterns established billions of years before humans existed to see them. That will continue wheeling long after we're gone. That don't care what stories we tell about the Earth below them. That simply are. Massive balls of fusing hydrogen, millions or billions of light years away, appearing to us as points of light arranged in patterns our brains are hardwired to find meaningful. Not because they are meaningful, but because we are meaning-making creatures. Because we cannot help but see patterns, cannot help but connect dots into stories, cannot help but find significance in the arrangement of things that were never arranged for our benefit. And that's okay. That's human. That's what we do. We tell stories. We find patterns, we create meaning from randomness. The problem comes only when we mistake the stories for reality, when we hold the maps so tightly we can't see the territory, when we love our theories more than we love truth. Imagine, if you can, a single night somewhere in the vastness of these territories. The year is 1400, more than 6 centuries ago, but not so distant that we can't feel our way toward understanding. Timur rules from Samarkand, his empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India, his capital filled with captured craftsmen creating buildings of impossible beauty, his treasury filled with plunder, his library filled with manuscripts, his court filled with poets and scholars and sycophants. And in a small caravanserai, halfway between Bukhara and Kashgar, perhaps near the oasis of Katakurgan, where underground springs feed date palms and create a green space in the brown vastness, a dozen travelers have stopped for the night. They're tired. They've been traveling for weeks. Their clothes are dusty. Their faces are lined with sun and wind. Their backs ache from long hours in the saddle or walking beside pack animals. They smell of sweat and horses and the peculiar mustiness of people who sleep in their clothes and wash when water permits rather than daily. Among them is a Sogdian trader named Rustam, 43 years old, returning from Beijing where he spent 6 months negotiating for silk and porcelain. His grandfather's grandfather's grandfather traveled this same route. The family business passed down through generations, each son learning the languages and customs and routes from his father, each building on accumulated knowledge of which merchants to trust, which routes to avoid in which seasons where the best prices could be found. Rustam carries a letter from a cousin in Turfan, written in Sogdian script, that his family has used for generations, but that is slowly being replaced by Persian and Turkic. He worries about bandits. There were reports of trouble near Kodjent. A caravan was robbed last month. 3 merchants killed. The bandits were caught and executed, but it makes everyone nervous. He misses his wife, Amina. They've been married 20 years. 3 children survived infancy. 2 daughters married. 1 son learning the trade. He hopes to be home before the autumn rains make the roads treacherous. Before his wife's birthday, he's carrying a porcelain bowl for her, delicate, painted with phoenixes, that he bargained 3 days to obtain at a price he could afford. There's a Persian scholar named Omar, 23 years old. Traveling to study at a madrasa in Samarkand, he carries manuscripts of Avicenna's medical texts carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from dust and moisture. His father, a physician, saved for years to make this journey possible, to give his son access to teachers better than any available in their home city of Shiraz. Ahmad is nervous, excited, but nervous. He wonders if the teachers will accept him, if his preparation is adequate, if he'll be able to afford the fees, if he'll make friends or be lonely in a city where he knows no one. He practices arguments in his head, trying to perfect his reasoning about the nature of the soul, about whether consciousness survives death, about the relationship between body and mind. A Mongol courier named Temur, not the emperor, just a man with the same name, 35 years old, carrying messages for his Khan, sealed documents he hasn't read and wouldn't read even if they weren't sealed because that would mean death. His horse is lame, picked up a stone somewhere. He needs to requisition a new one at the next Yam station. The postal system runs on fresh horses. A courier can't afford to be slow. He's exhausted. He hasn't seen his children in 6 months. His wife died 2 years ago in childbirth. The baby died too. His mother is raising his 2 surviving children, a boy 8 years old, a girl 6. He wonders if his son has learned to ride yet, if his daughter still remembers him, if his mother's health is holding up. He sends money when he can, but it's never enough. An Arab merchant named Khalid, 57 years old, with spices from India, Indian pepper that makes the tongue burn, Ceylon cinnamon sweet and complex, cloves from the Moluccas that preserve meat and mask the taste of decay. He calculates profits in his head. Margins on each commodity, fees at each border, bribes that have to be paid, transport costs. He hopes the spices will fetch good prices in Tabriz. The market has been soft lately, too many merchants bringing the same goods, competition driving prices down. He's getting too old for these journeys. His knees hurt in cold weather. His back aches. He gets tired easily. Maybe 2 more trips and he can retire. Let his nephew take over the business. Spend his last years in comfort. They don't all speak the same language. Rustam speaks Sogdian and Persian, and some Chinese. Ahmad speaks Persian and Arabic. Temur speaks a Mongolic language and some Chinese. Khalid speaks Arabic and some Persian. They manage through interpreters, through gesture, through the universal language of travelers who understand that everyone here is far from home and deserves courtesy. They share bread, Flatbread baked in a tandoor oven at the caravansary, still warm, torn into pieces and passed around. The ritual of sharing food, breaking bread together makes strangers into temporary companions, makes the world a little smaller, a little less hostile. They share tea, black tea from China, sweetened with honey, poured from a pot that's been refilled a dozen times today, each person getting a small bowl, sipping slowly, letting the warmth spread, letting the caffeine revive tired bodies, letting the ritual create a sense of community among people who were strangers this morning and will be strangers again tomorrow. The Persian recites poetry, verses from Hafez about love and wine, and the soul's journey toward the divine, his voice rising and falling with the rhythms of the Persian language. Even those who don't understand the words can hear the beauty, can feel the emotion, can recognize that this matters to him, that poetry is not decoration but sustenance. The Sogdian sings a song his grandmother taught him, a melody older than anyone can remember, in a language that will be dead within 2 centuries, the notes rising and falling in patterns that sound strange to ears accustomed to Persian or Arabic music, but beautiful in their strangeness, haunting. The others listen quietly, recognizing that they're hearing something old, something being preserved through oral transmission, something fragile. The Mongol describes the grasslands of his homeland, how they shift from green to gold as summer turns to autumn, how you can ride for a week without seeing anything but sky and grass, and the occasional herd of wild horses, how the wind never stops, how the stars at night are so bright they cast shadows, how the silence is so complete you can hear your own heart beat, how home feels like the center of the world even though it's just grass and sky and emptiness. And for a few hours, in that small circle of firelight in the immense darkness of the Central Asian night, the world feels unified, connected. The differences between them, language, religion, ethnicity, culture, all the things that divide people matter less than what they share. The need for warmth, for safety, for human connection, for the recognition that everyone here is fragile and far from home and deserves kindness. This scene happened thousands of times. Every night along the Silk Road, in caravansaries from Antioch to Xi'an, strangers became temporary companions, shared meals, shared stories, shared the warmth of a fire and the comfort of company, and through those encounters, repeated millions of times over centuries, ideas moved with the goods, stories traveled with the travelers, languages borrowed words from each other, customs cross-pollinated, technologies spread, religions encountered each other and sometimes fought and sometimes merged and sometimes coexisted peacefully. This is what Tartary actually was, not a single civilization, not a unified empire, not a mysterious advanced culture with hidden technology, but a crossroads, a meeting place, a vast territory through which flowed not just merchants and armies but ideas and techniques and dreams, where cultures encountered each other, where synthesis happened, where the very diversity that made it hard to govern made it endlessly creative and adaptive and generative. Somewhere in the vastness of the steppes, a city stands empty in the moonlight. Perhaps it's Otrar, destroyed by Genghis Khan in 1219 after its governor made the fatal mistake of killing Mongol merchants. The Khan's revenge was absolute. The city was leveled, the population massacred, the governor executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, the horror of that specific death preserved in multiple chronicles. Perhaps it's one of the smaller settlements along the Tartaria, abandoned when the river changed course, when the irrigation systems that sustained agriculture failed because there was no longer water to sustain them, when the people moved to where water still flowed and left their old home to the wind and sand. Not mysterious, not evidence of conspiracy, just the normal fate of human settlements, built with hope and ambition, inhabited for a while, for decades or centuries or millennia, eventually left behind when circumstances changed, when the resources that supported them disappeared, when better opportunities existed elsewhere. The stones of those walls remember nothing. They're just stones, shaped by human hands, weathered by wind and time, waiting for archaeologists who might one day carefully excavate and study and add to our understanding. The wind moves through these ruins, has moved through them for centuries, will continue moving through them long after we're gone, carrying dust, carrying seeds, carrying the memory of everything that happened here in forms so dispersed they might as well be forgotten. And yet, not quite forgotten, because we're here tonight, thinking about these places, wondering about the peoples who lived there, trying to understand what was real and what has been imagined, trying to separate history from myth, trying to honor the actual achievements of actual peoples rather than attributing them to convenient fictions. Rest now. Let sleep come gently. Let the theories and conspiracies dissolve like morning mist. Let the questions remain, but hold them lightly, as possibilities to explore rather than certainties to defend. Let the wonder at human achievement across centuries be enough, more than enough, to fill the spaces where mystery once seemed necessary. The night settles, the stars wheel overhead, the earth turns, and somewhere in the vastness of Central Asia, in the territories once called Tartary, the past and present and future exist together, not hidden, not suppressed, just there, waiting for anyone patient enough to look, humble enough to learn, honest enough to admit both what we know and what we'll never know. Sleep well, knowing that the world is rich enough without needing impossible mysteries, that human achievement is remarkable enough without requiring lost civilizations, that truth, complex and incomplete as it always is more worthy of wonder than any comfortable fiction. The wind crosses the steppes. The stars trace their ancient paths. The earth turns. And the story continues, being slowly uncovered, carefully studied, gradually understood, one discovery at a time. Good night. From Simply About Earth. Sleep well.